All right, guys, welcome to Monday Night Anatomy. Today we're looking at my favorite muscle, glute max. What an awesome muscle. So this is the bad boy here, Gluteus Maximus. So glute means butt and Maximus means big, right? So we're looking at this bad boy, Gluteus Maximus. And so let's first of all look at the attachment point. So where does it sit on the bone, the skeletal structure? So essentially we've got here that the glute max sits on the ilium, so your pelvis, okay, like on that kind of ridge of the pelvis there. Okay, and this is called the superior gluteal line, just below the ridge of the pelvis. This is called the iliac crest, this section here. And you can see this kind of like line there. That's the attachment point of the glute medius, this inferior gluteal line there, superior gluteal line here. So where you kind of got like these rough areas on the bone, that's generally where the tendon's attaching. The tendon is the white and the red is the bone. The muscle. So we got basically the max attaching onto the pelvis and it also attaches onto the sacrum. So this big triangle shaped bone here, this is the sacrum, this is the base of the spinal column. And then we also have some fiber attachments onto the coccyx. Okay. And it's a big shaped muscle, kind of wraps around. Underneath this muscle, we have all the space in here. This is the glute where you've got your glute medius and your piriformis and your glute minimus in here. So you've got two other big glute muscles sitting underneath there. And then the distal attachment is on the femur. So you've got this line here. Okay, and there's what's called the tibial or the femoral tuberosity. Or the gluteal tuberosity. So it's a roughened part of the femur that gives the tendon this kind of attachment point. So where you get a tendon onto a bone, there's often a roughness to it, or a bump or a lump. So for a good example of that would be here on the knee, we have this kind of lumpy bit here on the shin, just below your knee. This is the tibial tuberosity. This is where your quadriceps attach onto here. So where you've got like a bit more rough bone that kind of grows and it has a stronger part of the bone because that's where the tendon's going to be pulling on the bone. So it's actually quite a long insertion and it's on the back of the leg. So if we orientate the leg around, so this is from looking behind, so this is the posterior view. And you can see these kind of two lines that come up through here. So this is the posterior femoral line, and you've got the glute max attaching onto it, but also then you've got the hamstrings attached onto the back here as well. So the hamstrings literally attach down the entire length of the femur, but we'll get to that when we go over the hamstrings. What's to kind of really note here is that the attachment of the glute max is on the outside of the femur or the lateral edge of the femur. So if that line up down through here is the middle of the femur from the back, this is on the lateral aspect, and that becomes important because that helps kind of like tell us the action of the muscle. So when the muscle contracts and it pulls, what kind of action it has on the actual bone on the femur. The other part here is that this part of the tendon is going into the iliotibial band. So if I put that into our diagram here, give it a second to tibial, give it a second to populate. ITB, let's go left. So this is the ITB band here. So this is this big strip of connective tissue or fascia, which goes down the outside of your leg or the lateral side of your leg. And so it basically, from the fibers of the superior fibers of the glute max, then kind of blends into the fibers of the ITB band, which then goes on the outside of the thigh, of the quads, so laterally, and then attaches in this area here on this tibia and on the fibula here as well. So it's lots of fascial attachments here, but essentially this whole area of your lower limb. So this is the tibia, this is the fibula. This is all a fascial attachment of the ITB band. It kind of spreads out into that. Okay. So you also have lots of other kind of attachment points and other muscles coming down from the shins here as well. So it has an effect across the knee, so the knee joint, and then also across the hip joint here via the glute max attachment onto the femur, and also the glute max attachment via the IT band across the knee. So when the glute max contracts, it affects both joints. It affects the acetobulofemoral joint, so the AF joint, so where the femur goes into the acetabulum, the pelvis, and also the femoral tibial joint or the knee joint. So depending on what position you put your leg in and how you're doing the movement, you're going to get different effects on the joint. Okay. So let's have a look at some of the movements of the glute max. So let me go into motion. So we have hip abduction is the first big one. Give it a second here. And so this is looking from behind where the leg is taken out to the side. So this is like a lateral leg raise or hip abduction. So when the muscles contract, okay, they're going to pull on the bone, okay? And remember the femur is like a big ball and socket that sits in the acetabulum. And so when it pulls on the bone, it's going to, because there's a hinge here, because it's going to pivot on this point here. So when it pulls that way, this is where the pivot is, it's going to actually bring the leg out to the side. So like a side kick. So anytime you're kind of like taking your leg out to the side, that's a big part of that is glute max doing that. Hip abduction, hip abduction. So hip abduction. So that kind of is important. So if you're doing squats, if you take your legs out into a wider squat stance, okay, you're still going to get a lot of glute max. Deadlifts, you can still get lots of glute max in a deadlift because even if your legs are slightly wider, because they still have this abduction movement. And if your legs are in more abduction, so a wider stance, you're actually putting this muscle in a pretty good position to contract versus a narrower stance. It doesn't have a strong line of pull. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to line up these muscle fibers and you want to get them lining up so that they can kind of, when they all contract together, the cumulative effect of pulling on the femur and on the IT band together creates a line of pull, which then rotates the femur or abducts the femur out. Okay. So the other motion we have here is hip extension. I'll give it a second for complete anatomy to populate there. And this is where the leg comes behind you. So this is looking from the side. So squeeze your butt and it pulls the leg behind you. Now, this is where core stability training is really important, right? So Newton's second law of motion, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if this butt muscle here is contracting strongly to pull the leg back, okay, there's going to be an equal reaction of the pelvis to get pulled down this way. Okay, all right. Or another way to think about it is if the leg doesn't move, so if the leg stays where it is, okay, and this muscle contracts, it's going to pull your pelvis backwards. Okay, so this is going to rotate depending on the orientation of your leg. It's going to create a pull down this way. So your pelvis will then rotate. Okay, so from the side here, this is the front, this is the back, it's going to do that. And that's called a posterior pelvic tilt. Okay. All right. It's not good or bad. It's just this is different. Now, generally what we want to do is maintain a fairly neutral position in the pelvis Okay, maybe a little bit of anterior and posterior movement, so that we get this big pivoting in this massive pivot joint here. Okay, this big ball and socket joint. And so then, and to maintain that kind of pelvic stabilization, you need all these like core muscles on the front, like your abs, your transverse abdominis, your obliques on the back, the QLs, it's not pictured in this diagram, to be contracting what we call isometrically, so statically, to maintain this neutral position. So if the core is weaker, it's not engaged, okay, or there's lag between you starting the movement and the core turning on, so there's a slight delay between the two, then you get excessive movement into the lower back or into the pelvis, and that's where your alignment gets kind of a little bit skewed out, and that then can create sloppy movement or poor movement patterns, which potentially can create injury or just ineffective movement or inefficient movement potentially. So that's where kind of core stabilization exercises or core training or core stability or whatever label you're going to give it, or motor conditioning, okay, is really important. So you want all these muscles working together and timing together. Okay, so that's another really important thing. So muscles can reverse their action. So in this case, if the leg is stable and fixed, it's like you're standing on the ground, okay, and then if you bend forward, so imagine you're hinging at the waist. Okay, what's going to happen is that the glutes are going to pull down on the pelvis, and that's going to create like you standing back up. So that's the deadlift technique comes into play through there. So the movement's not the leg knot, it's not getting moved, it's the glute max pulling on the pelvis to create that reorientation. So if you visualize that, it would look a bit like here. So you would have, can I spin that around? I can't spin it around. So instead of the leg being pulled back that way, the spinal column is being pulled back this way. So it's kind of like that action. And that's kind of how the deadlift works. It reverses the action of the glute max. Okay. Now in running or jumping and stuff like that, what we want is from the heel strike. So from the heel strike here, okay, the glute max, you kind of drive your heel into the ground and it pulls it back behind you. So that propulsion coming this way propels you forward that way. Okay. So this is the primary driving muscle of what we call hip extension, also or locomotion. So walking, running, jumping. This is the primary muscle because it's very thick, it's very big, it's very powerful, and it has a good leverage. Okay, so it can create a lot of movement, a lot of force, and it links in with these muscles here, the hamstrings, and they work together in a team because the hamstrings create this movement as well. So when those two bad boys work together in a team, you get a powerful hip extension or leg being pulled behind you movement. Now, the other movement we have here is lateral rotation. All right, so if we come over behind, so you go knee flexion, and then because the fibers are attaching on the outside of the femur, okay, the femur rotates laterally. So that means that if you think about your kneecap turns out. So that's lateral rotation. So if I flip around to the front, so your kneecap would go out this way. So that's the kind of shaft of the femur is rotating externally. So it's rotating in a direction that's turning it or orientating it laterally or externally. So often this is often called external rotation or lateral rotation. Beautiful. Okay. So when you want to stretch your butt, okay, you put your foot, okay, in a little bit of lateral rotation. So that would mean it's like think pigeon pose. So you're lying down and you orientate your foot towards the center in that kind of pose. That laterally rotates the femur, which then puts this muscle on stretch. Okay. All right. And so you'd get a nice stretch in that regard there. Very good. Okay, so that's the lateral rotation component. So what the femur can do is all those three movements at the same time. So it can extend, abduct, and rotate the leg. So extension, abduction, and laterally rotate the leg. So if you think about if you take a wide stance in the squat, so your legs are both in abduction, you're in lateral rotation, and when you come up, you're going to extend into the squat. Okay, so you're going to extend into the squat. Oh, correction, I misspoke. If you want to stretch the glute max, you actually need to put it into internal rotation to stretch it, because on lateral rotation, so here the fibers are in the short position means they're fully contracted. You're not going to stretch it there. So correction, my bad. So to stretch it, we actually need to bring it back into neutral, and then potentially even a little bit of internal rotation. So you turn the leg out. So typically glute max is not a muscle you need to stretch too much. So the way you do that is to stretch a muscle, you reverse the action. Right. So we first, so if the movement is hip extension, so you flex the hip first, so you bring your knee up to your chest, that's hip flexion. And then if abduction is the movement of the hip, then you adduct, so you pull the knee across the midline. So knee to chest, then towards the opposite shoulder, and then you internally rotate the femur. So you orientate the leg inward. So it's going to look a bit like this. So it's going to be knee up, across, and in, which is pigeon pose. All right. So up, across, and internally rotate, and that'll put the muscle on stretch. So that's the simple rule. So when you're stretching a muscle, you just simply reverse the action of the muscle, and that lengthens the muscle so you can get a good stretch out of it. The nerve fibers for glute max are the inferior gluteal nerve. So let's go back here, see if we can find it. I think I put it in there. So you can see these little nerves here. This is the inferior gluteal nerve. So that sits between your butt muscles. So you, in this space here, you've got your glute medius and minimus. You've got piriformis. So when your deep butt muscles go tight, it can kind of compress these nerves a little bit, and it can make your glute max go a little bit tight. Typically, you don't see a lot of issues with nerve impingement with glute max. It's usually deeper hip muscles like the glute medius and piriformis. And this nerve comes out of the L5, S1, S2 here. So it's kind of coming out of these branches here. So if you've got a disc issue at L5, S1, so in this space here, okay, that potentially might create some impingement or some kind of neural deficiency to the glute max. Okay. But typically, you don't see a lot of glute max neural impingement unless there's some kind of disky issue coming from your L5. You won't get it in these ones here. It'll be from L5S1. So if you've got a disc issue or degenerative disc disease where the actual lumbar discs here are basically decreased in size, so you can get some neural compression of the nerves coming out through here. And when a nerve gets compressed, it interferes with the signaling coming from the spinal cord, and that can create either muscle hypertrophy or hypertonicity. So the muscle gets too tight and doesn't relax much, doesn't return back to its resting position. So it kind of stays at a low tone of contraction, or the opposite, where it's not getting enough neural drive and it gets inhibited. And when that happens, the muscle gets weak and it atrophies. And because it's a primary hip driver, this entire lumbopelvic kind of mechanism is affected, and you get a very weak hip and lower back. So to do back rehabilitation, this muscle is one of the absolute keys we need to get strong, because it's such a big, powerful muscle, and it's involved in all standing, sitting, like standing up movements, so squatting, lunging, hip, hinging. If this muscle is not working for whatever reason, then the body's gonna have to rely on other muscles to do the job. And this is the main one. We want this bad boy working. So this is why we want glute max working. So this is why you learn how to squat. This is why you learn how to hinge. This is why you learn how to lunge. This is why you learn how to do step ups. Because those 4 exercises, a squat, a lunge, a hinge or a deadlift, or a step up, those 4 key ones, all train this glute max. And when this bad boy gets strong, a lot of mechanical back pain issues basically can just disappear because of the strong driving role of the glute max, and also because it's just stabilizing the sacrum, the SIJ joint, because it crosses both the ilium and the sacrum, sacroiliac joint. It stabilizes the acetobulofemoral joint, so your hip joint. It has a role in stabilizing the knee. So it's basically a multi-joint muscle, powerful movement muscle, powerful stabilizer. And when you get this bad boy working, a lot of mechanical pain issues just disappear, which could be in the lower back, it could be in the sacroiliac joint, could be in the hip joint itself, and can also even be in the knee joint itself. So there's an approach in rehab where we go training is rehab. So when you just train somebody to be able to do fundamental movement patterns correctly, so good alignment, good posture, good timing, good technique, good core bracing, learning how to drive through the hips, create that hip extension, creating the mind-muscle connection. When you teach somebody that, so the body is working mechanically really well, outside of any kind of neural impingement going on because of degenerative changes in the spine, you can resolve pretty much back pain just by training that. So training is rehab in that regard. So once the muscles have enough strength to perform their role, okay, then they can contract and then they can relax back to the normal position and things just start working better. And particularly when you get the glute max working with the hamstrings and the adductors, and you link that in with the core stabilization on the front, and then you teach somebody how to tilt their pelvis correctly, then magic starts to happen. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that little kind of anatomy tutorial on glute max. It's really good to get appreciation of where the muscle goes and what it does. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how to engage the hamstrings. So we'll see you then.